Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you again for your willingness to do this. I think this is important. So thank you very much. So Dan, if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to walk folks through the agenda for the day. Thank you so much. So we're going to begin with an opening that will include a land acknowledgement. After that, we're going to get into an introduction to kind of explain this project, how it came to be, where we're at, and what we're really proposing through this work. We're going to go through a policy model overview. So we're going to do the first part one, and we're going to begin kind of going through some of the different areas of focus for this policy model as we're seeking to roll it out. We're going to actually take a 10-minute break, just recognizing again that everybody needs a little bit of space and time. We want to be accommodating for anyone's needs. So we are asking that you return at the end of the 10-minute break, but it'll give you an opportunity to do your bio break, take a stretch, whatever you might need, even review materials if you want to come back and think about anything you might want to ask. So we'll come back from that break, then continue our policy model overview, and then we'll go through a closing and an opportunity there. So throughout this entire event, we are going to have a chance for everyone that wants to ask a question to be able to do that. And we also will make sure that you will have an opportunity to provide any comments for us to consider. So thank you so much. Very exciting. So now Kate's going to take us through describing the great work. Oh, I'm so sorry. So yeah, let me go ahead. If you can go to the next slide so that I can do the land acknowledgement. Thank you so kindly. So it's important to know that Rights and Democracy is located on the land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among the indigenous people for thousands of years, and as the home of the Western Abenaki people. Rights and Democracy honors, recognizes, and respects these people, especially the Abenaki, as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we gather today. In that spirit, today we'll begin by acknowledging that we are guests in this land. We need to respect and help protect the lands within our use. Thank you so much. So we are deeply grateful for the opportunity to be able to gather here today on occupied territory. So now Kate is going to help support us in talking about the work of the Renew New England Alliance.
Thanks, Kaya. And we can go to the next slide. So just really quickly, so you have a sense of where this whole thing is coming from in the first place. We'll give you a little bit of context here for the next 15 or 20 minutes about who has been doing this work so far, why we're doing this work, and what we hope to get out of it before we dig into the individual policy areas a little bit. So the group that has produced the policy model that we'll be discussing today is now formally named the Renew New England Alliance. It is a 30+ social and economic justice, labor, and indigenous organizations from each state in New England. Only a handful of groups per state were invited to participate in this policy modeling process, and the expectation from here on out is that we'll bring every group that wants to participate in at each state level. The policy team managing this modeling process was the Brown University Climate and Development Lab and the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is not based in Stockholm. It's also based in Massachusetts. And the purpose of this group was to gather input from grassroots, labor, Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations from each state in New England to develop a decarbonization model that is centered in commitments to equity and justice. And Kaya, now back to you in the next slide.
So really what we are trying to address are three different overlapping crises. So right now we are all feeling very acutely what's happening with the coronavirus pandemic, that it's creating untold unemployment. We're in the midst of a deep economic recession, and that causes incredible strain on our society. We're also dealing with systemic and extreme economic inequality. Those are not things to take lightly. We're seeing the rising costs of basic needs, wage stagnation, and that is also compounding this work that we're trying to do. And then the third crisis that's right there waiting as we're dealing with all of these other pieces are also looking at climate change in and of itself. So climate change is still there. We're still predicting out about 10 years before we start seeing another major issue. And all of our states have had something happen most recently. So these are different pieces that are all compounding on each other and are making it necessary for us to come with a really comprehensive strategy that both is going to address our climate change issues and slow down the speed of this climate change and degradation, as well as rebuilding and revisioning the society and the communities, the state and the nation that we need. So these are things to keep in mind and to hold very closely. I want to also bring into this, as we're thinking about what systemic and extreme economic inequality are really touching on, we're also, in this moment, we're also trying to deal with systemic racism and the impacts of white supremacy, and what that's done and how that's created the economies and the extractive industries and so many other things that we're trying to address in this moment in time. So this is really important to understand where we're going from here. So I just saw a question pop into the chat where someone was asking around using the term climate change versus a climate crisis, a deliberate choice, and why. It is because it's actually a crisis. And when we think about climate change, when we use the word change, it's very often talking about a slow-moving sort of thing, a slow-moving trajectory of something that would happen. That's not what we're actually facing right now. We're facing an actual legitimate crisis, that one that we have to do really robust mediation to be able to get us back to a place of some sort of solvency for a future that we hope to have. So that is part of that. So thank you. So, okay, thank you. So up next, I appreciate that. So also within this root crisis, again, the systemic devaluation of our life in a profit-driven capitalism model. So thinking about nature, our Black, Indigenous, and people of color, our migrant communities, the poor and working class, women, older adults, youth, people with disabilities, non or deindustrialized communities, and depopulated rural communities. And this is really, really important because globally, what we found is that in particular, people of color are hit the strongest, the hardest, and have the most disparate incomes when it and outcomes when it comes to climate crises and our environmental challenges. They're the most likely to feel those effects in multiple ways and are the least contributors to that actual crisis in and of itself. So it's key that we really keep and focus and center this work on bringing about collective liberation, but in lifting up and improving the lives and the quality of lives of our most marginalized and those most directly impacted by this crisis in and of itself. So I want to give an opportunity if there are any questions around how this project is defining what are our root crises that we're dealing with. And you're welcome to throw those up into the chat. Also as well, if you feel like this is resonant for you, please let us know. Again, feel free to use your emoji reactions. Feel free to throw that in the chat. We take comments and we take questions and we take praise and we take critiques. We take it all here. So are there any questions that people are holding around this particular component? So there is something that came up. It says, I like this. So I take that this effort is explicitly anti-capitalist. We know that capitalism has created much of this, and we're going to get deeper into those conversations around our economic models and our extractive industries and how they're fueling all of this. So thank you for that. Also adding in those that have, there was a question here around mentally ill. We consider that within the category of individuals with disabilities, and that's how we frame that, because there are some that are visible and some that are invisible, and individuals with disabilities are also disparately impacted by our climate crisis as well. Just one more comment and then we'll move on. So we use climate crisis to add more urgency around the issue. Climate change isn't very strong or compelling. Yeah, so we definitely agree around that. Okay, last chance. And then we'll pass it on to Kate to talk us through those economic models that we were just speaking about. Okay, I think we're ready to move on. Appreciate it.
Thanks. So we're going to be talking about two different economic models. The one is the one that we're living in now, and the one that has produced the crises that we just discussed. And they're all founded on a myth that we have the potential for infinite growth in our economy. Here, I like this diagram because it simplifies nature and people down into two categories in the way that they relate to our current economy. The goal of this economy is maximum growth in profits, and that is achieved through providing affordable consumer goods that people want to buy. So on this model, nature is reduced to two meanings. One is as a source of infinite natural resources on the input side of the economy, and on the output side of the economy, nature is expected to endlessly care for us, regardless of how much waste and pollution we produce as consumers. And then as human beings, as individuals, we're reduced to our meaning as workers on this model. Our input into this economy is our labor. So you can imagine that leaves out a bunch of people. People like babies, anyone who can't work isn't meaningful within this capitalist economy. And then on the output side, our meaning as individuals is insofar as we can consume things. So this is the system that has produced the crises that we're in. Obviously, there are also a lot of distinctions internally to that system that make it even worse for some folks rather than others, as Kaya mentioned before. And but we don't want that anymore, so we're going to turn to what I think is a more hopeful vision for thinking about our economy on the next slide. So the solution to that impoverished economic model is a regenerative and distributive economic model. It's nicknamed donut economics, coined by ecological economist Kate Raworth. And it's a considerably more complex diagram, but really simply what it amounts to is that there is a safe and just space for humanity if we properly design our economy. The outside boundary to our economy has to be the world that we live in. There is an ecological ceiling to the growth of our economy. And once we overshoot that boundary, we see on the outer circle a host of consequences for our home when we overshoot the ecological ceiling of where we're living with our economic activity. But we also need to, so I think this is one of the arguments that people make, like we just need to get from point A to point B as quickly as we possibly can in addressing the climate crisis. However, we need to also recognize that there's an inner boundary to the safe and just space for humanity that includes a far richer picture of what it means to be a human being than a worker or a consumer. And ecological economists have tried to capture the richness of the various needs that we have. If we overcompensate for the devastation that we have caused to our natural environment, without taking into consideration human needs for things like peace and justice, equity, adequate housing, food, and health, the ability to work and provide income for ourselves and our social networks. So this is the model that is the foundation for the policy model that we're going to be sharing with you today. Any thoughts, questions about this before we move on to the next slide? Feel free to speak up or drop a comment in the chat. Okay, sounds like everybody's good. So Kaya, next slide is yours. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Now I'm unmuted. All right. So I had many things to say. It was a whole speech. So I'm glad to be able to share this with you. The core value shifts that are going to be really necessary for us to be able to make this work are to really look at the binaries that we have here. We have on one end oppression and inequity, and that needs to be replaced with freedom and equity. We think about our economy of scarcity and our scarcity models, especially that we use within this work and often within the non-industrial complex, the nonprofit industrial complex. We also have an opposite that could be about plenty. What does it mean for us to constantly say that you must earn any of the things that are inherently your human rights, to moving to a place where it's all of us? Everyone has that, and it's less of an individualistic kind of model, and it's a collective model. Moving away from division, where we're constantly creating silos and partitions between the work that we're doing, our communities, and the vision that we have, to one that's actually based on solidarity amongst groups. What does that mean for us to move from stasis, where we feel like we're constantly stuck, but we're recognizing that the world's burning around us, but we can't do a whole lot about it, to moving into a world of possibility, imagination, fun even, which can be healing, creativity, which can be nurturing. Moving away from a space of isolation to one where we feel a genuine connection with each other, especially in this moment as we're dealing with literal social isolation and social distancing. What does that mean for us to still be in community together? And thinking about every man for himself versus we're all in this together. And every man for himself is important because we're using that particular terminology as the idea of who is personhood, who holds personhood, and who holds power, who holds voice and agency, is absolutely built on a cis hetero patriarchal kind of model, where we're looking at cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, wealthy, white males as the normalcy that we're all never going to reach. And so it's really trying to reach that ideal that is keeping us back. And instead of thinking about that, we're thinking about how we're all in this together, that it isn't necessarily a bootstraps model that we're going to need to get this work done. Thinking about oligarchy versus democracy, right? Thinking about endless growth and regenerative economy. And we're thinking about war and peace, right? How does that feel? Does those sound right to people? Give me some thumbs up. I'd love to see some emojis, throw some things in the chat if that feels right to you. If those are values that are important to you, please let us know. Also, have some really excellent opportunities. We have some excellent opportunities, if we move on to the next slide, to do this work through policy change. And so the policy solution that we've come up with, that this group has come up with over this time, has been inspired by, it's the Renew New England, is what we're calling this project. And it's inspired by national calls for a Green New Deal, for what's called the Red Deal, and for just transition. And so for those of you who may not be familiar with Red Deal is really based off of, as well as Green New Deal. So Green New Deal is based off of the New Deal that we may be familiar with from history, that was really looking at a comprehensive shift and how our government was interacting with individuals, building up an economic empowerment and changing our infrastructures. Many major changes happened. The reason why we are not adopting that particular name at this point in time has much to do with a racist history of that. and the fact that that still did not lift many of our marginalized folks. It was inherently exclusionary to many people of color, and that the changes that happened were not salient beyond that moment. And so many were left behind. From that, the Red Deal demands have also come forth, and those were generated through Red Nation out on the southwestern part of the United States. That's really looking at and saying, you know what, there is no New Deal. This was the original deal. These were the original treaties that the United States were supposed to uphold when they decided to, eliminate us from the face of the earth. We're asking and demanding these things right now as part of Indigenous sovereignty. And then also looking at that just transition work and what that looks like. And we think about that when we talk about a nuclear power plant, but do we think about that in other areas of industry and in the work that's necessary to reach this liberation? And so why New England? So we think about New England because we have greater numbers and powers, greater power in numbers, I'm sorry. We have the ability to really collectively come together and utilize our voices, our resources, and our genius across states to be able to make a much more comprehensive plan that will stick. So instead of us feeling like we have to continually fight these battles on our own, on an individual basis where we're able to make small measures, being able to build this much larger chorus of voices that includes a population that is equal in size to that of California, that we can get some things done. So we've made that commitment across these states. And so again, why not a Green New Deal for New England? As we spoke about that, this is us needing to change history and needing to imagine a world that does not exist. And in order to do that, we have to move away from some of those same constructs and even language that is historically violent and exclusionary. So this is something that we know should be national, but we also recognize that we need to prepare for the worst, and that will happen better if we are working across state lines. So we're working to try to avoid a race from the bottom and preventing capitalism and capital from migrating to neighboring New England states with lowest minimum wage, just kind of race to the bottom sorts of things that can happen when we don't have a unified voice of demands. So this is our moment and this is our opportunity. So questions around that? Questions, comments, feel free again, throw thumbs up, give me big smiles, thumbs up, thumbs down, applause, throw things in the chat, throw questions in the chat. Let us know how you're feeling. Okay. All right, fantastic. Thank you all. Okay, so now Kate's going to talk with us around the goals of this project. So thank you, Kate.
Yeah, and just before we move on, I saw a chat comment stream by among a bunch of thumbs up and praise. I also see Julie's comment about personally hating the name New England. I feel that, especially given the conversation we've been having so far. But Jael also made the comment regarding the donut model of economics, that it doesn't include animals and nature in the safe space. I think that's a great question. I'm not really prepared to answer that, but I think it should be right there in the donut, right? So clearly that donut is not sufficiently inclusive and is a little bit anthropocentric at this point, which, is what it is. So we'll just have to contact Kate Rayworth. I know we've got one or two ecological economists on this call too. So feel free to jump into the chat and talk about how you envision revising Kate Rayworth's donut model to address Jael's concerns. We certainly should. So thanks for that, Jael. So, right, what are the goals of the Renew New England Alliance? What does it mean to achieve renewal? So foundational to this policy model is the commitment to develop thriving, equitable, and sustainable local economies that center the priorities of workers and frontline communities and create good paying unionized jobs. A next goal is a zero carbon energy sector in the region by 2030, no later than 2030. And then the next target after that is a zero carbon building and transportation sectors by 2040, which includes everything you could imagine about buildings, including heating and cooling, as well as everything you could possibly imagine about transportation. And again, we'll get into the specific policy areas after the break, but just want to share the big picture goals with you right now. And the final goal is to enact reforms. And actually a comment just popped up and I can't even see the text on the screen anymore. Sorry about that. Enact reforms that make government inclusive of and accountable to the communities it serves. So we need to take the crises that we're facing in this moment and use them as an opportunity to deepen and widen our democracy. So those are the goals.
The chat is just discussion on New England as a term. So yeah. No question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yep, those are the goals. I hope you feel good about those. I feel like they're great. They are not, modest at all. And so unless folks have questions about those goals in particular, again, remembering that we'll get into the details later on. Then Kaya is going to move on to tell you about the core commitment of the work that we're doing.
Okay, everyone, thank you for that. So now we're going to talk about one of the core concepts it's going to see this thread running throughout. So beyond the concepts of collective liberation and of equality that we're looking to establish is a jobs guarantee. So the focus on this is to really create a comprehensive policy model that's going to be looking at ensuring that everyone who wants a job in this new world will have one. We're going to be able to look at preserving and creating jobs to help support these goals. We're looking to really strengthen and support our local and small businesses and business models. New public employment initiatives as well, they're going to be needed for some of the infrastructure pieces. And core commitments to really looking at improving and modernizing regional infrastructure and noticing that everyone's basic human needs are actually met. So each of these goals is really centered on a human experience and around creating the ability for anyone who wants a job to have one and they'll be a part of this new model. So love to hear your thoughts. If there's questions, comments, if this feels resonant, again, let us know. If it doesn't, let us know. And any specific questions you have that might relate to that particular component. We are going to, again, get into the details of the policy model, which there might be some questions you might be holding as well that could be answered with greater specificity in those pieces. So we will get into the more finite points. Thank you, Gisela. Those are great. Okay. Okay, fantastic. All right, so thank you. We're gonna move on. Kate's going to then talk about the 6 basic needs that we are gonna be trying to address within this policy model. Kate.
Thanks. Yes, so one of the things that happened in the middle of this policy modeling process, which began in January, is that we entered into a worldwide pandemic. This policy model was going a little bit of a different direction, and we made a course correction in response to COVID-19, and then we deepened our justice analysis in the midst of the uprising that we're in right now for Black lives. So in addition to centering this policy model in a jobs guarantee, we organized the policy model around 6 basic needs. So our jobs guarantee program is centered in the need for housing, healthcare, food, energy, transportation, and clean air and water. And then we have some additional policy demands regarding how this will all be financed. And so after the break, which we are just about to go into, we will focus on each area. Yeah, and I see those comments about labor unions. Labor unions were intentionally included in the policy modeling process in every state. So that was, in addition to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations being a priority, labor unions were a priority for the policy modeling team as well to be included. And you know, I'm realizing I think I skipped past some notes for myself at the beginning of the presentation when I described the Renew New England Alliance. Just so you know, the current members of the Renew New England Alliance, the folks who participated in this policy modeling process over the last few months include 350 New Hampshire, the Coassuck Band of the Pennacook Abenaki people who are based in New Hampshire, Granite State Organizing Project, New Hampshire Youth Movement, the Nulhagen Band of the Coassuck Abenaki Nation based in Vermont, Rights and Democracy, and the Vermont AFL-CIO. And the New Hampshire State Employees Association have participated as much as they possibly could, but they're in the middle of a very fraught contract battle this year with a very unfriendly governor. I see that comment around wanting education to be one of these planks in the jobs guarantee program. I think that's excellent feedback. I appreciate that a lot, and we will pass that right back to the policy modeling team. So thanks for that, everyone. So now, speaking of basic needs, we are going to take a 10-minute break where you can attend to any needs that you might have right now. We recognize not everybody wants to sit for 90 minutes straight staring at their computer. So please go, be free for 10 minutes, and we will see you back here at 3:50. Welcome back from your break. I went for a brisk walk and I'm ready for this opportunity to dig in a little bit. So just to recap, Jobs Guarantee Program is centered in housing, healthcare, food, energy, transportation, clean air and water, and then there are some additional policy demands regarding financing. And first we'll turn to an overview of the commitments of the housing piece of this policy model. So our housing program, the Jobs Guarantee Program centered in housing will build tens of thousands of new carbon neutral, climate resilient, affordable housing units and repair existing units and install green retrofits. Again, because we are in the midst of a significant economic recession, each of these aspects of the policy model are centered in a plan for economic recovery. Economic recovery with regard to housing is going to happen through employing workers in the building trades, increasing demand for sustainable materials, and addressing our affordable housing crisis, which is yet another epidemic throughout New England. We also recognize that we need an additional policy to support fully implementing a housing plan that is just and equitable. So we're advocating for rent stabilization policies in every state in New England. We have a little bit of time here, so this is a great time to ask questions about each particular area that we're focusing on right now. So please feel free to unmute yourself and chime in or put a comment in the chat. Does this feel like the kind of program we need to have around housing right now? And is anything missing?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Gary. I really love the ecological approach of this in the broadest sense, that it's not just about, quote, nature, but that human communities are part of nature, whether healthily or out of whack. And it's really great to see that this vision includes issues like housing. It's and all the other relative issues that to renew New England, to have an ecologically, socially just, sustainable society has to include this as part of the natural ecology of communities that we're wanting. So I really love this. And I think this could be something that DSA in Vermont, at least particularly Champlain Valley DSA, I really want to present this to them to let them know how expansive the vision is of this. So kudos to y'all.
Thanks, Gary. I really appreciate that. I think that's the heart, that gets at the heart of each one of these areas, is considering each of these needs in a very, very broad context, the broadest possible context, where we want to end up. And I see another couple questions that came up in the chat. Natalie has asked regarding new housing. Do we have kits or prefabs already designed that meet these points? I think we absolutely do. I've seen prefab models that absolutely have these kinds of goals in place. And I think one question then comes down to land use policy, actually, around those kinds of housing units. So that's a great question. For sure, that is a more efficient, ecologically efficient way to build new housing. Pat Martin asks about training for workers to do the work. Finding workers in New Hampshire has been a challenge. Yes, great point. The other slides do a better job of addressing this particular aspect of each policy area. Each one of these jobs guarantees programs includes a plan for free training. Based on some feedback from labor unions, we might end up adjusting free to paid training as this policy model evolves, as we get more and more feedback on it. And I think a crucial component of each aspect of this is that these will be livable wage jobs that include training. So we're going to be asking people to leave professions that are exploitative and extractive in nature. And we are going to need to offer training in order for folks to participate in those. And many, many jobs are going to be created. Yeah. Bottleneck in construction, sure. On a model where you're trying to maximize profit, there's more profit in big homes. So we need to create the kind of internal incentives that we need in order to be able to fill our housing needs and employ people well. Yeah, push Buffalo. definitely was one of the influences on this policy model for sure. Folks have been trying to draw from things that are already being done in other places. No reason to start from zero. We can just learn from the great stuff that folks have already done. I am not sure what, oh, okay. Yeah, right. Modular homes won't be allowed here, I think is what Bonnie is saying by saying that she's on the Salem zoning board. And so there are going to need to be some policies that support this through land use reform.
And it will also probably need to look on a community-wide basis as well, because, I mean, not all, I mean, manufactured homes is a pretty broad category. And so there are equity issues in that as well, in that they're often made somewhere else and then brought in. So we aren't always able to hold on to that sort of like local labor component other than once they're being assembled, so to speak. But they're not always just as we might think of them as single or double units. There are actually, we have mansions in southern Vermont that were built on manufactured housing. So, but there are neighborhoods that sometimes have covenants that are like, you can't put manufactured housing here if you're building, like, because of the stigma that they want to create around class, around thinking about what that means to have manufactured homes. So
absolutely, and you'll see this in other slides too. I think one of the core commitments, right, is to rejuvenate local and small business, and that includes the manufacturing sector. And I think Kaya, you dropped a reference to Vermont in here as well. So yeah, we're hoping this will stimulate that kind of rejuvenation of local production as well. And we're falling a little bit behind. I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about each policy area. So let's just move right along into healthcare.
Great, thank you. So healthcare. So this Jobs Guarantee program is looking to build hundreds of community health centers, which are different than your private practices that you might be familiar with for primary care. These are truly, they're much more unified and integrated medicine. So you'll have multiple specialists perhaps that might be on site. They are meant to be able to be free, if not drastically reduced in cost. They may have dental chairs within that space as well. We've seen these models work in many different spaces. I know that Senator Sanders has been really a champion of that for many, many years. That's actually how I met him, fun fact. So community health centers as an alternative to dealing with our fee-for-profit healthcare system. That building is going to require as well quite a bit of local labor and training of folks within that. So we need to expand our public education programs to start doing that training and certifying healthcare workers. We know that we are actually we're getting to a real crisis level as far as the number of healthcare workers that are able to step into the workforce at this point in time. And many states, as they're dealing with coronavirus, especially our smaller states, are having to use travel staff to be able to make sure that their needs are met on the local level. We need to shift that and be able to create that opportunity for people to step into that work. Looking at economic recovery through employing people, again, through that building of the community health centers and providing health care, and by providing free health care at those community health centers, so being able to help people have more economic solvency to have their health care needs met. And then an additional policy, we're always going to promote universal health care insurance, right? So those are all different pieces that we have here. And there was I just did see, taking a look at a couple of things in the chat real quick. Should have heard, so Patricia, I'm just reading these out in case there's anybody that's on the phone or can't see this. You should have heard the fuss about a Planned Parenthood use, residential development in Ringe, any consideration of expanding telemedicine since expertise can be delivered to remote locations. There definitely, telemedicine is a big part of making access to healthcare reasonable, but with that, there's another comment also, broadband has to be expanded. We're also finding that people are having major challenges with connectivity. So if it's not accessible to all, then it isn't really accessible. And then hoping to see trans non-binary healthcare covered and protected. Yep, that's going to be important and across all states. It's not explicitly named at this point, but it's something that should be brought up as we are again trying to help support our most marginalized who are impacted by the lack of these resources being available. So other questions or comments that people might have around that, that particular part of the platform? Okay, all right, well, thank you. And Kate is going to walk us through food.
All right, so food. As we were talking about before, needing to relocalize as much as we can of our economy into our region. Food is an important aspect of that. I'm not sure. I think I'm in a friendly audience here for sure, but maybe not all of you know that about 1/10 of food consumed in New England is actually produced inside the region. So this is another place where we see our money flowing out of the region, and a lack of economic development in our region because we're not producing our own food. So our Jobs Guarantee program will expand support for small local farmers throughout New England and build a larger network of regional farms. And as part of that, of course, restore natural ecosystems through the implementation of agroecological best management practices. So we're going to achieve economic recovery in our region through growing our agricultural industry, employing people to farm, constructing irrigation systems, and distributing food. It was really helpful the other night, Kaya, when you brought up the fact that the longer policy statement includes trying to encourage the development of worker cooperatives, farming cooperatives. This is really important in particular for allowing people who don't come from a farming background and don't have intergenerational wealth to enter into farming as a profession. We'll also employ people by constructing irrigation systems and through food distribution. There are so many great models. Again, this is just a very, very high level overview with bullet points. So I know you all know a lot about this, and we are very excited about this particular aspect of the policy model. And certainly we also agree that we need an additional policy around food security and ensuring that we're also expanding our food assistance programs in our state rather than contracting them, which is the current trend. Any thoughts? I haven't been monitoring the chat while I've been speaking. Oh yeah, absolutely. Incentives for farmers to transition to regenerative ag and sustainable methods for sure. That is just a foundational premise of this model. And yes, local processing, local distribution hubs. I mean, one of the things that I think I took a class a couple of years ago, or a few years ago at this point, at UVM on food systems economics. And one of the things that we saw there was that the carbon footprint of local farming can actually be quite high compared to mass transit for food produced in other regions. So one of the, when we're considering food and its relationship to transportation, we'll need local processing, and we'll need to aggregate that as much as we possibly can to minimize the ecological footprint of our own food system. It can absolutely be done. We have great models. There are tons of brilliant people working on that already in our region, and their genius just needs to be tapped and encouraged. Yeah, and policy and employment should be inclusive of migrant workers in our region, Tyler said. Absolutely. So we need to be centering worker justice throughout this, and in the longer policy statement, certainly ensuring that there are no workers left out of the picture is one of the core commitments. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on to energy? Okay, take it away, Kaya.
All right, so now we're going to dip into energy. So we're looking at a jobs guarantee program that's going to install solar panels, wind turbines, and energy storage devices to ensure 100% zero carbon electricity consumption by 2030. We're looking at economic recovery through employing workers to design, produce, and install renewable energy systems. We're looking to provide free, extensive job training for folks to work within that sector. And awesome additional policies that we're looking at as well are around prohibition of new fossil fuel infrastructure, regulating our utilities, energy efficiency, and looking at that energy efficiency standards for buildings overall, not just within new construction, but as a whole. So I know this is an area that when we typically think about this work, it's either pollution or we're thinking about our energy consumption and our use. And if our goal is to look at that decarbonization, then there's so much more that we need to consider in there. So this is, I'm sure, an area that folks want to dip into. So I'd love to be able to hear more of your thoughts. Feel free to throw them in the chat to unmute. So no thought of putting a price on carbon pollution. So at this point, the platform is not speaking specifically around a carbon tax per se, but that does not mean that within the statutes that you currently have that you can't look at those components from state to state. There's some different solutions. We're going to get into the financing components where it's going to think about where taxes might come into play for some of this stuff a little bit later. So I know it can get really easy to go there, and I don't want to take that deep conversation and deep dive and creative thinking away from that particular section of the presentation. There is another comment from Julie that's saying, I think in Vermont, the regulation for solar and wind needs to change drastically for this to work. It's nearly impossible to build community solar in Vermont. We know that that is typically the case for most kinds of major societal changes we're looking for. There's a lot of things that have been built into our legal system that make it just onerous to try to do the kind of changes that we need. Discussions of energy infrastructure, such as upgrading, such as smart grid. This does speak to investments within energy infrastructure. And so that particular solution will be teased out. Yes, I would really like for Renew to consider it. Thank you. So yes, the financing side, we will definitely talk about all of that work. Other thoughts or questions? Does this feel good? You got thumbs up, thumbs down? Anything else you have questions or want clarification on? Okay. Does energy include heat? Yeah. Energy transferred, right? So, yeah, so we're looking at all of those pieces, and as well as some of that when we're looking at heat comes into, as we were talking about housing and construction, and thinking of that work as well. Okay, and community power, those are all fantastic ideas. Thank you so much. So we're gonna keep going because I wanna be thoughtful of everyone's time. Transportation is the next area, and that's very exciting, and so Kate's gonna walk us through that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, and again, like Kaya said, we will get into the financing pieces a little bit later. And just to address the community energy question, again, with as high level a presentation as this, we're not getting into the aspects of democracy that are relevant to every one of these areas. But those are the commitments and the goals of the overall policy model. And if it's a little weak at present in this current draft with respect to how democratically any one area is conceived, then we should definitely dig in. on that. And I see questions around biofuel, which is also relevant to the transportation issue. So let's just go ahead and cover transportation, and then we can talk a little bit more about biofuels. So the Jobs Guarantee Program relevant to transportation will prioritize building a large-scale public transit system. Throughout New England, obviously, we have diverse communities and a lot of rural space, particularly in our states. So installing EV charging stations and incentivization of installation of EV charging stations or electric vehicle charging stations is absolutely going to have to be a component of this policy model for the more rural areas of New England. We'll achieve economic recovery here through employing construction workers, engineers, transit operators, and mechanics. And then an additional supporting policy will be to subsidize electric vehicle purchases as well as transit. And then when we think about, so I'll just refer to the question of biofuels as well. I've seen extremely successful biofuel projects that were based on a community level through, for example, oil recycling for restaurants, but that's still, still based in crops that are often monoculture, and if they aren't sustainably farmed in the first place, then you're just kicking the problem down the road. So the policy model as it's written right now doesn't really refer to biofuels at all. It really does kind of envision a large scale public transit system that is reliant upon renewable electricity and electric vehicles largely for its transportation, in addition to other things like, of course, bicycles, if that's possible for you. Might not be possible for you if you live out in the NEK, but it's going to require a large scale change of habit in the way that we transport ourselves from one place to another. Any other thoughts on transportation before we move on? I see a comment here. We got back to energy here around net metering. Had a similar question the other day. And yes, we've heard about wanting to move the net metering issue forward in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has a long way to go in its regulatory reform with respect to energy. And let's see, Laura Lynch says that we're working on an EV charging station here in Temple and working on a large ground mount for solar in our town for our municipalities, which is great. Oh yeah, and I love this question. I remember, Julie, when I got the email from you about how Vermont Gas was trying to peddle the idea of renewable natural gas, which is great. We'll just avoid, believing that there is such a thing as a fossil fuel that can be renewable. I mean, what? Clearly not a viable transition fuel. So any other comments? Any other comments here on this transportation plan before we move on? Love to hear your thoughts, if you've got any others. Yes, yeah, definitely. Electric school buses, says Pat Martin. Okay, well, let's move on to clean air and water.
Clean air and water. So this Jobs Guarantee Program is looking to create a New England pollution cleanup task force. So we're looking again at how can we do this across our states and really making a commitment so that we're all acting in accordance together to have a much more significant impact on dealing with pollution cleanup, and recognizing the resources that each state might have that can help support the others within creating a solution and a path forward. Looking at creating a comprehensive region-wide recycling and composting system, again, not having to place it on any of our smaller states to try to have to come up with this sizable solution that needs quite a bit of coordination, and for us to be able to think about that really responsibly and collaboratively. Building out our economic recovery through employing workers to help with that pollution cleanup in a way that will be safe and will not create further hazards to their health. Running this new recycling and composting systems and reducing pollution associated illnesses. And so some of that, it's not only just around the cleanup, but it's also around how are we supporting individuals that have been impacted by pollution, by changing the future, right? So additional policies are in protecting Indigenous sovereignty, which is necessary, strengthening standards and enforcement around maintaining clean air and water, and replacement of lead pipes, which especially in the old housing stock and the old communities that we have here, some of the oldest in the nation, clearly, these are all challenges that we're going to need to deal with. So Sununu could use his engineering background to help with cleanup. Of course. We have a stable genius as well who knows about these things, learns them quickly too, in the White House. So we will, I appreciate everyone's participation in this. We're not quite finished yet, and I do understand if you do need to get ready to go, but I want to, there's more, but wait, there's more. I know y'all want to know how we gonna pay for it, so don't go anywhere. Are there questions around clean air and water? Are there thoughts or additional comments that might be helpful? Folks feeling good? Folks feeling good? I know it's 4 o'clock. I feel you. Okay, so this is great. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us. So now we're gonna go to financing, and Kate's gonna help support that.
Yes. So yes, the question is always, how are we gonna pay for things? And Pat, this is where you probably aren't going to hear what you're wanting to hear. We can definitely have a little bit of a conversation there. We're scheduled to go until 4:30, so we're doing very well on time. The financing plan proposed in this policy model is going to begin with the concept of coordinated, so regionally coordinated state bonds. The global green bond market has seen an amazing amount of growth over the last couple of years because as we're asking companies and institutions to divest from fossil fuels and other polluting industries in their pension funds and in their endowment funds, they're looking for other investment opportunities. So the state bond fund is one of the first finance options we see as being very promising. Furthermore, federal recovery funds that are directed to states, we want to make sure that those funds are directed to these programs and not to corporate bailouts or tax cuts for the wealthy. So at the state level, we have some control over the way that federal funds are directed. And we want to direct them into our programs. We'll continue to experience disasters and federal relief money, and we want it to go here. Also, because of the scope of job creation, relocalization of business, building up the businesses that are already here so that they're flourishing, paying workers a livable wage. We are going to see major financial stimulus in our region, which will lead to increased local and state tax revenue. Furthermore, again, because of this localization of our energy, relocalization of manufacturing, relocalization of food production, community health centers, locally trained employees, folks being able to stay in our region and make a living for themselves. We're going to reduce money flowing out of the region, particularly the extraordinary amount of money that we spend on fossil fuels on an annual basis in both of our states. Further, we're finally going to, we're going to implement fair taxation for the wealthy and for corporations. What we know is that in every state in New England, the effective tax rate of the wealthiest residents of our states is considerably higher than almost every other demographic right now. It's just it's just unnecessary. And so we can help to finance these programs through implementing fair taxation. We know that there, even in Vermont, that's already a topic of conversation in the legislature. Looking forward to seeing that happen in New Hampshire. And then finally, our public green bank is our final idea for financing in our states. These banks would manage a portion of the capital controlled by states instead of hiring large out-of-state investment banks to handle their funds. So again, that keeps the money in the local economy, keeps those jobs in the local economy. Oh yeah, I see. It's a great question. And so that's the final piece of the finance plan in this policy model. Just a quick comment on carbon pricing in general. I know that these programs can be well designed. I think the concern around carbon pricing is that it is a regressive tax in general. The same tax per dollar is charged for anyone paying it, regardless of their income. So it's really hard to control at the front end of a carbon tax for inequity in taxation. There are a number of ways around it, but what this policy modeling team found was that they could model full financing for these programs using these 6 strategies without having to implement carbon pricing regime, although obviously it makes sense for a pollutant to cost more to use. I think in this case, we recognize the inequity at the front end of that. And so without a well-designed carbon tax, we're concerned about the impact on the most marginalized and economically repressed folks. So that's the financing plan.
Okay, it looks like Pat Martin has a question. She raised her hand.
I just wanted to say, it is very popular in Canada, carbon fee and dividend. And the way that they've designed it, unlike in France, the way that they've designed it, the dividends are paid first. Even though low-income people spend more of their income on energy, it's still a smaller footprint than middle and higher income people.
Sure.
So they actually do better under a carbon fee and dividend. So, I understand it took me 6 years to finally embrace carbon fee and dividend. It took me a long time because I kept hoping New Hampshire's legislature or our Congress would vote those funds to build the things that we need built, but they're not going to. And, so there's so much support on the Republican side, relatively speaking, for a carbon fee and dividend. I kind of think, it's a free market solution. And even the oil companies, ExxonMobil, say they support it because everybody would be on the same footing. They know there's a problem. They know that they're driving us off a cliff.
Yeah.
So I just ask that Renew keep an open mind towards this and look into it a little more, because with carbon fee and dividend, that also gives us a mechanism for paying farmers and foresters to sequester carbon.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, I will certainly pass that feedback on, and I know who you are, Pat, so I'll make sure to reach out and let you know what our policy modeling team has to say. Thank you. And then I see another comment here about how much Vermont legislators get paid. Kaya Morris, former Vermont legislator, would be happy. It's better than New Hampshire, obviously, at $100. It's hard not to do better than New Hampshire, but not much. So Kaya, what do you have to say about that?
So, yeah, so legislators get paid. It's a citizens legislature just like your own that has a seasonal kind of component to it that goes kind of January through May, but it's full time during that time. So legislators are able to access about $12,000 a year, which is not sufficient for anyone because you're still required to, more often than not, still work full time. Many people are still trying to do both, unfortunately, while trying to serve. So it makes it really difficult for young people. It makes it difficult for anyone who isn't wealthy and retired, essentially, to serve in office. So it's that is an enormous challenge, and that's something that within Rights and Democracy we're trying to do our part to think about what that looks and feels like, so that we can get legislators that can help pass some of these, that share that vision and believe in that vision, to be able to push this vision forward. So, and again, this is imagining worlds that don't exist. This is that science fiction that we hear about that's so important for us to hold close to. These financing proposals, many of which we don't have, we're going to need that infrastructure in almost any approach that we might take in order to ensure that it doesn't get diverted, and to ensure that we actually have that it's sustainable. So these are all pieces that are really necessary as well for any solutions that we might want to put forth. So thank you.
And brilliant.
Right. Take us home, Kaya.
All right, y'all, you done did it. So we are here. Yes, you did. Thank you for staying with us on this vision, and we're really hopeful around this. So we recognize that our rolling crises, from the coronavirus pandemic, economic inequality, and ecological collapse, demand serious and comprehensive action. And all three of those crises that we've talked about, they pose rapidly escalating threats to people's basic needs, from clean air to water to housing, food, and healthcare. And so we really need strong policies that will speak to that urgency that we're feeling, and that's here, and the vulnerability that people need to feel that they're feeling in order to unite us and make a really broad coalition, regional, that's going to be capable of actually generating the kind of political will that we need to address this. We can be a model for the rest of the nation, as we always have been. And this is our opportunity to really lead this conversation. So the next steps that I want to encourage you, if you want to continue to be more involved in this work, reach out to your RAD organizing team. In New Hampshire, you'll want to connect up with Isaac Grimm. In Vermont, you'll want to connect up with Dan Fingus right there. Thank you so much, Dan, for providing us fantastic technical support and making sure we didn't lose nobody and unmuting when necessary. We appreciate you. And as RAD members, for those of you that are members, contact your regional organizer or Dan or Isaac to find out more ways to get plugged into this work. We'll have some exciting announcements coming in the coming days and weeks, and we hope to keep you engaged in this great work. So I want to thank you so much. Thank you, Kate. Thanks everyone for being on here and sticking through this. And I hope that you are able to go out and enjoy the day for whatever it is. Take that break, do that self-care so we can continue this fight. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Kaya.